Good morning. My name is Ann Margulies, University CIO. On behalf of the CIO Council, welcome to our 8th annual Harvard IT Summit. As is customary at our IT summits, we will begin with an IT joke. Save those laughs, I think I'll need them. As we all know from our information security campaign, strong passwords are really important. But what you may not know is you cannot use beef stew as a password. It's not stroganoff. Okay. Since you like that one so much, I have another. How does Al Gore search the internet? Using an algorithm. Okay. It's the hardest part of my job. Okay. Oh, that hurts. As you know, the IT Summit is sponsored by the CIO Council, which is made up of CIOs from each of Harvard schools, as well as members of the Hewitt Senior Leadership Team. Please stand up, CIO Council. And please join me in thanking the CIO Council thanking them for the incredible work they do to advance the role of IT at Harvard, as well as to make Harvard the very best place for all of us in IT to work. The goals of our summit are to connect us to the university mission, to learn from one another, and to build our IT community across Harvard. I know this is going to be our best summit ever because for the first time ever, we have 3 blockbuster keynote speakers. We also have close to 40 concurrent sessions, and as always, plenty of time to meet and connect with your colleagues throughout the day. It's going to be a packed day, and you're going to have to make some tough choices. Special thanks to the Program Advisory Committee, who did an amazing job choosing the concurrent sessions that are extremely relevant and represent a broad variety of topics. We have sessions from faculty on using data to improve pedagogy, from staff on API development, and we have members of Harvard WIT, that's the Women in Technology group, as well as our more IT leadership group, who are offering quick advice in an Ask the Coach session. Please join me in thanking the committee for their great work, as well as thanking everyone who submitted ideas and proposals for sessions, and all of our presenters today. In 2012, the CIO Council launched the university's first IT strategic plan, which included 16 key initiatives that we decided made more sense for us to do together than school by school. All but 2 of those initiatives are now complete. The last 2, Harvard Phone and the API platform, are well underway. Altogether, these initiatives are providing an essential IT platform and foundation for the university. Having achieved so much of what we set out to do, the CIO Council felt it was time to develop the next iteration of the IT strategic plan. The revised plan aims to anticipate and support the evolving needs of our ever-growing university and help us focus our efforts over the next 3 years. The update is informed by input we gathered from key leaders, as well as partners across the university, to make sure that our plan aligns with the academic and strategic priorities of the broader university. Once again, it identifies initiatives that we should work on together as a university instead of school by school. We're excited to share the new plan with you today. You'll find a printed version inserted in the summit program, and we've also created a short video. Let's watch.
Technology at Harvard. It makes up our university's invisible campus. Every day, our students, faculty, researchers, and staff rely on technology. As stewards of IT at Harvard, how do we, the IT community, align our efforts with university priorities, draw on our distributed strengths, and row in the same direction? In 2012, the CIO Council defined the first shared vision for IT at Harvard. Over the last 5 years, we've worked together to deliver on that vision and reimagine what technology can do for Harvard. Guided by the new IT strategic plan, we'll build on our past success and work with our university partners to tackle new challenges. Here are just a few of the ways we'll advance the CIO Council vision. For the first time, Harvard has a powerful shared set of tools. Leveraging their full potential, we'll remove barriers, shrink our physical distance, and make it easier than ever to work together. Deepening our commitment to user experience, mobility, and accessibility will improve access to resources like course materials, videos, and digital collections from any device, anywhere. As institutional data increases, pursuing the next phase of data management will deliver a stream of insights to inform decision-making. Better data leads to better engagement. Working in partnership with Alumni Affairs and Development, we will help more than 330,000 alumni stay connected. These days, virtually every scientific and engineering breakthrough relies on computation. Through the Research Computing Council, we'll continue to grow our world-class, high-performance computing resources. The classroom will be brought to a whole new level, helping faculty bring subjects to life in ways never before possible. Beyond campus, technology is helping to pioneer new approaches to teaching and learning. With our university partners, we will unleash the potential of online learning and broaden access to all Harvard has to offer. Just as important, we'll continue investing in ourselves, the IT workforce at Harvard. Through programs like the IT Academy and our commitment to an inclusive and diverse workforce, we'll challenge our own thinking and drive innovation. We're excited to work with you on these initiatives and more as we move Harvard forward together.
The CIO Council is honored to embark on this work with all of you to help advance teaching, learning, and research here at Harvard. As I already said, this is a very special IT summit. We're delighted to welcome 3 very special faculty speakers today, so let's get right to the main event. We know intuitively that diversity matters, and our first keynote speaker is here to help us explore why. As a behavioral economist, she uses economics and psychology to identify ways in which we can de-bias how we work in order to increase diversity and close the gender gap. Iris Bohnet is the Roy E. Larson Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and teaches organizational design, decision-making, negotiation, and gender in public policy and leadership. She is the incoming academic dean of the Kennedy School and the director of the Women in Public Policy program. She's also co-chair of the Behavioral Insight Group and associate director of the Harvard Decision Science Library, and the faculty chair of the World Economic Forum's executive program on global leadership and public policy in the 21st century. Her book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design, is a bestseller and has been recognized all over the world for its insights in how to redesign organizations, schools, and society to make them places where we all can thrive. We are so very fortunate to have her here today. Please welcome Professor Iris Bohnet.
Good morning, everyone. What a great moment for me to be here with all of you. Hearing that this is one of the highlights of the year, so I'm truly honored to be able to share some of our work with you, and I thank the organizers for inviting me and for putting this event together. I also thank all of you for the work that you do. I know literally sometimes behind screens, as in literally but also figuratively, to make much of our work possible and to help us move in that direction of the One Harvard. So thank you very much. What I'd love to do with you in the next 40 minutes or so is tell you a bit more about how we can debias our workplaces in particular. That's what I'm going to focus on today. Because as you will see, I hope that my research is both interesting to you just from a research perspective, that there might be new insights that you hadn't known about beforehand, but maybe also, and this is a lot to say for an academic, start a discussion of kind of a toolbox of what are the tools that we could all use to level the playing field and make sure that the world and Harvard truly is an inclusive workplace where everyone can thrive. So the title of my book, as Anne said, is What Works? Gender Equality by Design. And I thought I'm just going to spend a moment telling you a bit more about what I mean with this. Because in many ways, the title summarizes the book quite well. So I chose the title What Works because I am a bit on a mission to bring more rigor into our HR departments, the kind of rigor that we might have traditionally used in finance departments and even in marketing departments, where we in fact have run experiments, where we have run pilots to understand, thinking about marketing, whether a shampoo with a yellow color is more appealing than a shampoo with a green color. We in fact now use this very same methodology in human resource management, in that we go into organizations and A/B test new types of hiring procedures, new types of promotion procedures, new types of performance appraisals. And much of the work that I'm going to present today is in fact based on those kinds of studies, where we have a true counterfactual, the treatment group and the control group, and then we can say, what actually caused the difference or what did truly work. And then gender equality by design is kind of self-explanatory. As Anne said, I direct the Women in Public Policy program, and our focus is gender equality. And I also want to say that, of course, I am fully aware that gender is not a binary variable, but you will see today, almost by necessity, I have to treat it as a binary variable because we just don't have the evidence, the data, for me to give you any evidence-based assessment on what works if I broaden that spectrum now. The design part is very close to my heart. I'm a behavioral economist by kind of profession, by background, and the work really came about because I had been doing behavioral economics for maybe 15 years of my life, before I came to the question of gender, really. And in that, it became clear to me, and it's always been a passion of mine, but I had done other types of work beforehand, but all of a sudden it became completely clear to me that the kinds of insights that we increasingly are using to improve our health or our financial decision-making, even our education, derived from insights in behavioral science, could also be applied to questions of people management, people development, and collaboration in our teams. So the journey I'd like to take with you this morning is that I want to tell you a little bit about the problem that we're focusing on, the tools that we're using, and then I want to hone in on two specific categories of questions. One is the question of talent management. So what does this tell us for the talent management piece? That's going to focus a bit more on formal procedures, and they are very important. But then I also want to ask the question, what does this mean for all of us who might not be managing a team or might not be in HR? How can we, in fact, design diversity, inclusion, and belonging in our meetings, on our screens, in our workplaces, in our classrooms? So that's where we'll go. And then at the end, I'll show you a short video clip where we summarize some of our work, which might be useful for you to have as a reminder of the types of things that you might want to think about. Okay, so now we're going to go right into things here, and I want to introduce you to Heidi Roizen. Heidi Roizen is a venture capitalist. She's a real person, and that is her real name. Heidi, and you'll see why it's important for me to tell you that this is her real name, because she is a very successful entrepreneur, but she became even more prominent, really, because Kathleen McGinn, who is a professor at the business school here, wrote a case study about Heidi. And you all have probably seen some of these case studies where you learn about the kinds of things Heidi did and why she's been successful. Now, it became even more interesting when a few years later, some colleagues of ours at Columbia Business School took this very same case and replaced Heidi's name with Howard. And it is now one of our favorite teaching tools to teach our students about the power of unconscious bias in a matter of 5 minutes. Because we now give the case with the protagonist being called Heidi to half of you, and the other half gets the case of the protagonist being called Howard, and you prepare for class. You don't know about the Heidi Howard thing. You prepare for class, but you also fill out a questionnaire before coming to class where you evaluate how well Heidi or Howard did in their jobs. So you evaluate their performance, but you also evaluate how likable they are. Would you like to work with them? Would you hire them? And sadly, what we find time and again is that students evaluate both Heidi and Howard as equally as capable of doing the job, so no difference in performance, but they do not like Heidi. They don't want to work with her or wouldn't want to hire her. Why is that? Even though, of course, the case information is completely identical, just the names are switched, because Heidi does not conform to our stereotypes of what a typical venture capitalist looks like, a typical entrepreneur looks like. She had kind of different careers. And it also doesn't conform to our stereotypes what a good woman does. So that's what we're up against. Now let me show you an image here and kind of ask you a very simple question. And that is, please compare squares A and B for me. And I presume that most of you see square B as being lighter than square A. I'm now going to cover the surroundings. And I presume about now, you realize that in fact they have the same color. Now, how is that possible? So I'm going to go back just to prove to you that I did not trick you. That's one reason why I want to go back. But the other reason I want to go back is to suggest to you that even though you now know that B is just another dark square, I presume most of you cannot do justice to square B. And that really is the big lesson here, in that we tend to see the world in patterns. We don't just put things into boxes, we also put people into boxes. Now here, of course, the pattern that you see is a checkerboard, and your mind also took this shadow into account and controlled for that shadow. And you knew that the logic of a checkerboard is dark square, light square, dark square. And literally your mind is not capable of escaping that logic. What I'm doing now is quite literally, I'm liberating your mind to see square B for what it really is. I'm covering the surroundings. I'm now making it impossible for you to see the pattern. So the question, of course, before us here is, what are the kinds of patterns that you normally see in your lives? And linking it back to Heidi, of course, that is part of the reason why it is hard for us to evaluate Heidi as positively as we evaluate Howard because she doesn't fit the box of VC or entrepreneur. Now, this is, of course, not a woman's issue. This is the issue of counter-stereotypical people. Men experience the same thing as kindergarten teachers. In our minds, that is not the box that men belong in, even though, of course, women can be wonderful engineers and men can be wonderful kindergarten teachers. So that's what we're up against today. But the good news is we now have an increasing number of interventions which actually help us get this right. I'm going to start with a very local one here that in many ways also has motivated my thinking. Most of you probably are familiar with Claudia Goldin and Cecilia Rouse's study. Claudia is at the Harvard Econ Department here of 2000, where they showed that the introduction of blind evaluation procedures and orchestras dramatically increased the fraction of women. In fact, it has helped increase the fraction of women from about 5% in the 70s to now more than 35%. We're about at 38% right now among our 10 biggest symphony orchestras in this country. The Boston Symphony Orchestra, I'm happy to say, was one of the very first ones to introduce the curtain and had musicians play their music behind the curtain because they were concerned that just possibly, even though they absolutely wanted to hire the best musicians, they might not actually hear the music when they see the people. So blindness is one example of behavioral design. Blind evaluation procedures are one example of behavioral design. I'm starting with this both as a real example, as an increasing number of companies, in fact, HSBC, Deloitte, the British government, blind themselves to the names on people's resumes. So it's a real example that real employers now are implementing, but it's also a bit of a metaphor for us, because I suggest to you this is what it's going to take. We have to go into our systems, into our procedures, into our practices, and de-bias these procedures and not our mindsets. So that is actually very different from the many things that we have been doing in the last really 50, 60 years, I would say, starting with the civil rights movement. This country in particular has spent a lot of money on diversity training programs. And another colleague here at Harvard, Frank Dobin, has done amazing work showing, sadly, that they do not work. In fact, I have not found one single study showing that diversity training works. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't figure out a training that could do a better job. But on average, this is really hard to do. And it is hard to do because our minds are pretty stubborn beasts in many ways. It's actually hard to de-bias minds. Now, the evidence gets a bit more encouraging as we're moving down the list here, and mentoring and sponsorship and networking, as we're getting more into behavioral stuff, kind of moving beyond just having virtuous intentions, but actually think about the kinds of behaviors that we want to espouse. So that's where I want to take you now, and we want to dive right into talent management and talk a bit about the kinds of things that we can be doing on talent management. I'm going to start with very low-hanging fruit here. So I have Coca-Cola up here because I started by saying, you know, marketing departments have figured out some interesting stuff, and I'm not particularly, you know, endorsing this particular finding, but I am suggesting to you that marketing departments often have used more rigor to understand what works. So here's the example of Coca-Cola. They learned a few years ago that men were not buying Diet Coke. And that's, you know, a very good question. Why are men not doing that? Could be lots of reasons. Maybe men run more along the charts, or they care less about their calories, or diet is not their word. And so Coke introduced Coke Zero, Pepsi introduced Pepsi Max, and most soft drink companies now have a gendered drink for men and one for women. Again, we're not saying this is right or wrong, But what we are saying is there's something in the language that we use that signals to our consumers, but also to potential job candidates, whether this is a job for them. So here is an example of teachers. This is a real example of a job advertisement, an excerpt from a job advertisement that a school sent to me. And this was a school, a primary school, elementary school, which wanted to hire more male teachers. Because as you know, in the US, about 85% of our elementary school teachers are women. And increasingly, this is a problem for boys because they no longer have male role models in their upbringing. And some of them, of course, also don't have their fathers in their lives. So this is an excerpt, I'm reading from it. Looking for a warm and caring teacher with exceptional pedagogical and interpersonal skills to work in a supportive, collaborative work environment. Now, the adjectives that we have highlighted here are adjectives that in our minds are associated with women. This is not to say that men cannot be warm and caring and work in a supportive work environment, but in our minds, this is associated with women. And so in fact, we now have the algorithms to do language analysis to predict based on your job ad, how likely are you to attract men? How likely is the language that you use? How likely is that language going to attract women? In fact, I told Anne before, I'm just coming out of a conference that we hosted at the Kennedy School on gender and technology. And one of the startups doing this kind of work called Textio was there kind of telling us about how they now use machine learning and algorithms to help all of us get better at everything that we write. So in job ads, we already have a very good database, in fact. But there's no reason we shouldn't use that same kind of scrutiny in our letters of recommendation, for example. Really in any text that we write, so we can make them bias-free, and in the example of the job ad, of course, then benefit from 100% of the talent pool and not limit ourselves artificially by choosing the wrong words. So what you can do is you can either neutralize the ad by taking away very gendered words. That's what we did here. This is just an example, looking for an excellent teacher with exceptional pedagogical skills, or you can counterbalance the words. So to make sure you have both male stereotypical and female stereotypical words in the ad. We don't currently have that library yet for race, but people are also working on that library for race. But you can imagine what that would mean if we could, in fact, really do a better job being very inclusive in the language that we use. Now, this is very low-hanging fruit. That's what I said, and I have to tell you, I haven't yet found an organization that when they heard about this, they didn't implement. Because nobody is out there kind of literally saying, oh no, we want to kind of not care about 50% of the talent pool. Now, it's getting harder here as we're climbing up this kind of talent career path here. In that, so what's happening when people are in fact in the door, so beyond recruitment, you now just have them in the door and you have to evaluate them and their fit for your organization and their performance. Now, that's where a lot of bias takes place, as you might imagine, because it's very hard to do. And it's another problem here, in that most of us, including faculty, I should tell you, kind of think like, oh, half an hour interview, we're chatting a little bit, I'm just going to feel it, whether this person is great for Harvard. So that's, of course, not what's happening. I have a cheesy stock photo here a bit to suggest to you that almost everything we see here is wrong. So let me unpack this a bit. So first, I just suggested to you that unstructured interviews, just chatting a bit, are not doing well. In fact, they are the worst predictor of future performance. So the unstructured interview is the worst predictor of future performance in an organization. Now, what you do, you move from unstructured to structured interviews. Structured interviews mean you design the questions beforehand. Ideally, you have some information about which questions work, which ones don't work. Some of the big tech companies, of course, Google, for example, analyzes which questions, in fact, are predictive of future success at Google, so they constantly improve the kinds of things they ask. But already you get a lot of return for your investment when you just design the same questions for all people, and you ask, I mean, all job candidates for a particular job, and then you ask everyone the same questions in the same order. And then ideally, you compare their answers comparatively across. Think of this as doing this horizontally, right? Normally, we look at one job candidate, number 5, and then we look at everything, CV, interview performance, maybe the person wrote some code, they applied for a coding job in IT here, and then you look at them vertically. That is actually not the best way to do this, because we tend to fall prey to something that psychologists call the halo effect. In that, oh, I love your CV because you went to the same school that I did, now everything else is just going to feel like, oh my God, maybe not quite as strong a coder, but surely had a bad day. So if you do this vertically, horizontally, then you're much more likely to calibrate your judgments. Okay, first thing. Second thing is the panel interview. So we still do too many panel interviews. Why am I concerned about panel interviews? I'm concerned about panel interviews because of another insight in psychology that surely most of you are familiar with, and that's the problem of groupthink. Right? These 3 people here on the panel will not come up with independent assessments of the candidate because they hear each other and they hear the responses of the candidate, and maybe one of these people on the panel is more senior in the hierarchy and they will defer to that person. So I am strongly advocating one-on-one interviews. It doesn't actually cost the interviewer more time. It is more time for the interviewee, but on the other hand, we get better assessments. So I could say much more about this, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. I wrote an HBR article for those of you. Oh, no, this is an interview that I have up here. No, this is the article. Oh, no, this is the article. There's an interview and an article. This is the article on interviews, how we can do this better. There's a manual in my book on what does the research tell us and how to do this better. I think it's a solvable problem, but we will have to want to address it. And as I said, the good news now, I thought because this is an IT summit, I wanted to show you a bit about what technology does. It's super exciting for me now because there are an increasing number of startups who use these insights that we generate here at Harvard and translate them into software, helping all organizations de-bias their talent management to make it easier for all of us to get this right. In many ways, that's another curtain. It's not literally blinding ourselves to demographic characteristics, for example, but technology, and I think that's the exciting part about technology, makes things scalable, and in an ideal world, makes things easier for us to actually do. So the last topic I wanted to discuss on talent management is the question of career advancement. So I'm sure many of you are thinking now, well, the hiring stage is important, but it really starts to be an issue once people are in organizations. We all have seen these images of pyramids where a law firm starts out with more than 50% first-year female associates, and then at the top we have 12% female equity partners. So what is the challenge, and what are the kind of things that we should be worrying about, and what could we do about them? So first one is this question of support. And I gave you the example of the law firm because I've actually been working a bit more with law firms recently. And one thing that we found out actually pretty early is that, so they called me in and said, we clearly have a promotion problem. We do have a gap, a gender gap. We also have a racial gap. We also have an international gap in our promotion rates. So can you help us think this through? And so we did think it through and kind of looked at quite a bit of data as well. So there's things we could do with the promotion procedure, but we also realized that promotion doesn't start the night before the promotion meeting. It really starts in year 1 when you enter this law firm as a first-year associate, because what we saw in the data was that some people were given the cool assignments. They got the support from the important partners, from the rainmakers. And that's now called performance support bias, that some of us get more support early on in our careers, and that in this law firm also even translates into the feedback that you get to grow and learn, and that accumulates over the many years, and eventually you do have something that the law firm called a thin file. You literally have a thin file because you've never been included in kind of the great things, kind of to show your potential. So performance support bias is real. I think we have to be vigilant about that. What this particular law firm is now doing, they have centralized work allocation. This is one of the biggest law firms in the country. Centralized work allocation that it's no longer true that every partner just chooses the people who look like he does. As I told you, 88%, sometimes 80% of the partners are white men. We literally could show that white men choose other white men, and ideally white men who also went to the same law school that they went to in the first year already. So you have to measure, and then you have to assign and assign work more equitably, and then you have to track that over time. So support is important. Secondly, many organizations promote people based on their potential, which makes complete sense in many ways, in that you might want to grow into a different role. You might have been in a coding job, but you now want to move more into a managerial role, and whether or not you are a great coder is likely not necessarily predictive of whether or not you will be a good manager. Right? So then, that's what companies do. Then they look at potential and say, oh, does the person have the potential? And of course, the potential is, we don't know what potential is. Nobody knows what potential is. That's where stereotypes then kick in. And then we look at who else has made it in our organizations, and we use that as a measuring rod to evaluate potential. So what do you do? I can say we have a lot of evidence on this, but my best advice is for us to at least define what we mean with potential. In that we break it down into maybe 5 categories. Maybe it includes emotional intelligence, maybe it includes analytics, maybe it includes communication skills, whatever it might be. But we need to force ourselves to be very specific, very concrete, so that we can also have a discussion. Why do you think, she doesn't have the kind of communication skills that you're thinking about? So thirdly, many organizations do performance appraisals the following way, in that we have employees self-evaluate themselves, often with a ranking attached to that, and then share the self-evaluations with their managers. This is now not rocket science to imagine that my self-evaluation is going to affect my manager's assessment of me. In fact, we could show that. That there is an anchoring effect when I throw particularly a number at my managers, and we saw both gender differences but also cross-cultural differences. Because there's not every culture allows for people to stand tall and speak up for themselves and to shine the light on themselves. Right? Bragging is not everyone's thing. And so why would we use a system that perpetuates gender or cultural differences in bragging, or in willingness to brag or ability to brag, and would use that as a performance assessment? But that's also something that many organizations that I have spoken to have in fact just introduced, just not sharing self-evaluations before managers make up their assessments, has lots of advantages in addition to the ones that I just described now. Okay, so enough on talent management. I now want to go into what you will see, if you thought this was a little hard to do, into even thornier territory. And that is, so what happens in our organizations, in our meetings? What are the types of experiences that people have? What would we have to do to make these organizations really more inclusive? So a first insight here is it is a numbers game as well. It is not just a numbers game, but numbers do matter. So if our boardroom looks like this, it is hard for anyone to come in and say, let me help you be more inclusive. But numbers are not the only answer, of course. So you need roughly, again, this is not an exact science, but roughly a third would be very useful. If we had a third of underrepresented groups kind of in the room, and I know we can't always live up to those hopes, but that would change the dynamics quite a bit, because then people aren't perceived as tokens anymore, but are taken for the expertise that they bring to the table. So yes, critical mass matters, so numbers do matter, but it's also a question of culture, of our interactions that we have with each other, the words that we use, the micro inequities that some people experience where they are interrupted or where they're not given credit for a comment, or worse things such as racist or sexist jokes. Now here's my hope for organizations, and that is, can we find a way to move from the dirty beach to the clean beach? Because my simple question to you is, where would you be more likely to drop a piece of paper? And it's pretty obvious that that would happen on the left beach and not on the right beach, because the beach signals something to you about the norms and values that we uphold on this beach. And that, of course, is true for our organizations. What are we standing for at Harvard? What are we standing for, at any organizations? What images do we have? What kind of techniques do we use to move in that direction? And it starts with simple things. So recently, I was looking for an icon on expertise or expert in particular for another talk. And I found, or in fact, somebody who's working with me found this webpage randomly, the Noun Project called. And that started a whole search process for us, because we found that for the Noun Project, of the 224 icons for experts, exactly 6 were of women. It matters. It matters what we show. By the way, when you look up economist, I'm an economist, 0 are of women. So it matters that you think about the kinds of messages, the kind of icons that we use. And it matters what hangs on our walls. And I know Harvard has been on this journey of the portraiture project, which is really important. Sometimes I say, we have to hurry history. Hurrying history doesn't mean that we don't honor history, but we also have to hurry history a bit so that history can catch up with where we're at right now in 2018, so that our walls feel like they represent the kinds of people who are here. So I have to say, give you a concrete example, I'm going to brag for a moment on behalf of the Kennedy School. So when the new dean, Doug Elmendorf, became dean, he actually changed the wall in front of his office. It used to be the former deans of the Kennedy School, which is, of course, an honorable thing to do. But these were white men. It's now different images, now the community. It looks much more colorful, much more interesting, and is more inclusive. Now, these are examples. This is another example of the Kennedy School's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She's president of Liberia. So we've commissioned lots of portraits as well, because, by the way, as I was bragging about the Kennedy School, I want to bring us back to reality. It's only 12 years ago that Jenny Mansbridge, who is a professor at the Kennedy School, realized that of the many portraits of leaders on our walls, exactly 0 were of women. Now we have 50% female students at the Kennedy School, and I think I can attest for me, for my colleagues, that this wasn't intentional. We didn't want to signal to our female students that they're not made to be leaders. But it just happens. So some purposeful design is going to be necessary for us to move this needle on inclusion. Again, there are now startups. This is a former student of mine, it's an NGO, created something that she calls nudge art, where there's now T-shirts and office decorations and screensavers and lots of things, so that we all can do this more easily. There are now different search engines, one is called research, in that providing counter-stereotypical role models for people when they look up nursing, or when they look up football, or when they look up engineering. So I do think we can do that, but it does require some intention on our part. I want to give you one more example, and that comes from the UK. And I think this is an example, it's a real example that I was involved in, but it's also an example that I think is going to help you think about how to move from the dirty beach to the clean beach, because it comes down to norms. So this is, was in 2013 that the UK Secretary of Business, Vince Cable, called me and said, as you know, we're on this journey to increase gender diversity on corporate boards in the UK. Without the introduction of quotas. It's now 2013, we've made some progress. We've moved to, what you see here is 17% of board members were women at the time, but we're stalling. So we're not moving more we really need some behavioral science insights here to move that needle. And what you see on the screen is the cover of the brochure that they had in 2013, which they sent to me. And in the brochure, they give information on the kinds of things that companies can be doing, but also do a little bit of naming and shaming, kind of highlighting the companies which do this really well, etc. But I was concerned about this cover. And I'm concerned about this cover because what the cover tells us is that currently 70% of board members are female. That seems like innocent. But there's a lot of research suggesting that these descriptive norms, describing what the world looks like, can turn into prescriptions in our minds. Right? And sometimes information such as this can turn into justification for the absence of women in leadership. So we were lucky that Kerry Conley, who's also in the audience here, then redesigned the brochure for the UK government using this design here. So what do you see here? We're again looking at the 100 biggest companies, the FTSE 100 companies, and we tried to design, which was hard, but like little, companies. So every kind of box there is a company, and what you're now seeing is that 94% of the companies already were diverse in 2013, and only 6 had no women. What we're now trying to signal is, this is the clean beach, it's in reach. Right? We are now signaling that this is a movement, that we're on a journey, that the thing to do, the norm, is to be diverse. And that, in fact, is an important insight from behavioral science. These norm nudges generally tend to be quite powerful. So that rather than lamenting the absence of people of color, the absence of women, or the absence of people of different gender identities or sexual orientation, focus on how we can move this needle, how we can show success stories and kind of bring other people along to then, in fact, promote change. So the UK was able to increase gender diversity to 25%, not just with this, lots of other things. I wrote a case study on it. It's a Harvard Business School case study for those of you who are interested in the kinds of things that they did and that we advised on. In any case, I'm going to end here with the UK because there's lots of interesting things happening in the UK. Some of you might know that at the end of March, beginning of April, all companies with more than 250 employees had to report their gender pay gaps, publicly disclose their gender pay gaps. This was a gross number, so including everything. A lot of that difference was difference in hierarchy, difference in jobs that people chose, but it has created like a lot of movement among organizations. As in now, so, wow, what can we do? How can we close this? As you might imagine, has created some bit of work for us, but it is an exciting moment and another example of behavioral design in that transparency often is a very helpful tool to have. Back to Boston, we're trying this here as well, working with the Boston Workforce Council. This is something that we helped kind of create here. It's translating some of our insights into guidelines. And that's where I kind of started with saying, could we ever think about getting into tools? Now, typically that's like the nightmare for an academic, because we of course know, oh my God, I studied this, I ran an experiment in this particular place, in this particular organization, with this particular government, at this particular time. I have no idea whether what happened in the UK is also going to work for Guatemala or is also going to work for Singapore. And that really is the true statement. Now, having said this, I also realize we will not see change if we don't start translating our research and making it more accessible for practitioners and decision makers around the world. And that's what we're doing. This is a project by the Women in Public Policy program that is headed by Anisha Sandhi, who's also here in the audience, and our Gender Action Portal, where we're trying to do just that. So we're summarizing research papers for practitioners, policymakers, decision makers around the world. It's a platform that's available to everyone, open, free of charge, searchable by, what is it that you're interested in. And we always go back to the authors of the paper to get their final sign-off on our summary. And that's actually proven, obviously, as you might imagine, very important because researchers might want to put different emphasis or we might have misunderstood certain things. Now, I don't know this is really making a difference. We do know that it's accessed from every country, has more than 100,000 users. So it seems to be something that people are using, but of course this has not been evaluated. But again, it's a bit of a plea that you all, with your amazing expertise in technology, should help us, researchers who don't always see how important it would actually be to leave the ivory tower and make our research accessible to the world in a way that is useful for the end users, not primarily only for us. Okay, on that note, I want to close with a short video that is basically going to summarize what I've just described to you and might serve as a bit of a reminder for today's talk as you go forward. And please, if you could show the video.
Let's face it, you're biased. But don't get defensive. We're built to be biased. Does your brain think these squares are different shades of gray? Think again. Your brain took this shadow into account and made assumptions that this square was darker, based on the checkerboard pattern. This natural tendency gives us shortcuts to make sense of our world. The trouble is, these shortcuts, when applied to people, can result in bias. So, how do we avoid unconscious bias to build a better society? Behavioral design offers a new solution to collapse gender inequality in our lifetime. What if we could make it easier for our biased minds to get things right by changing our organizations? For example, in the 1970s, major US orchestras made an ingenious discovery. Adding a simple curtain to the audition process allowed them to listen to the music rather than judge musicians based on their looks. Not only did they acquire better talent, but the fraction of female musicians grew by more than 30 percentage points. Simple solutions like this can also debias our workplace. Simply removing the names on resumes gets a lot of the bias out of the way and allows access to the full talent pool of candidates. And here's some low-hanging fruit. Research has shown comparing candidates to each other, rather than the imaginary stereotypical applicant, calibrates our minds to the best, rather than those who we think look the part. Behavioral designs like these have doubled the fraction of women on the boards of the UK's largest companies in a very short amount of time. Seeing women in leadership, whether in business or politics, changes what people think is possible for their daughters and themselves. In 1993, India mandated 1/3 of seats be reserved for women to serve as elected leaders at the local level. This not only offered new insights into public policy, but also encouraged women to speak up in community meetings. And seeing women work made it more likely for girls in the community to stay in school, marry later, and delay having their first child. Kind of gives weight to the phrase, seeing is believing. Many organizations, including Harvard, have taken this to heart by hanging up more portraits of female role models. Here's what you can do today. Try changing who we look up to on our walls. So, yes, it's time to face it. We're biased, but we can design around it. We have the research and tools to cheaply and quickly redesign how we work, learn, and live. It's not only the right thing, it's the smart thing to do. And now it's up to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iris, for that incredible research. It's clear we are all biased. More importantly, thank you for creating tools that we can use. We can do better, and we will do better. Our second keynote speaker is no stranger to this venue. This is one of his classrooms. Michael Sandel's course, Justice, recorded here in Sanders Theater, was the first Harvard course to be made freely available online. He is the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government Theory at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. His books have been translated into 27 languages, and he has lectured on 5 continents. We have a short video introduction to give you an appreciation of his global impact.
He has attracted an enormous following around the world for the best Socratic dialogues since Socrates.
He's a philosopher with the global profile of a rock star. He's a Harvard professor who doesn't just lecture in halls, but in stadiums.
One thing the world needs is a better way of conducting our political debates. We need to rediscover the lost art of democratic argument. Tonight, we have begun that debate. Even where we had strong disagreements, people were listening to one another. This gives me hope that we can elevate the terms of public discourse. Too often, political parties and politicians, it seems, don't really address the questions that matter most about justice and the common good, the role of markets, and what it means to be a citizen. Tonight, you have offered an impressive example of what reasoned, challenging public discourse can be. If that's true, then we here together will have made a beginning toward renewing democratic citizenship itself.
Please welcome Professor Michael Sandel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Anne, and thank you for all you do in enabling us to pursue experiments in teaching and learning in this new world. One way of describing the big experiment that beckons is to see to what extent it's possible to take the distance out of distance learning. When we first began planning for the project that Anne just described, filming the justice course that took place here for many years and making it available, first we thought, this shows you how long ago it was. Well, public television, a lot of people will watch it on public television. And then they said we should have a website too. And the website was an afterthought. It occupied just a tiny fraction of the budget, and we almost thought, well, can't we use that money better elsewhere? We never would have dreamt at the response online. This was before the word MOOC was invented, before edX, and we were astonished to find that people, by the tens of millions, wanted to watch lectures about philosophy. Part of what attracted them, though, was the fact that here in Sanders Theater, and maybe we hope also in the places where they watched, people didn't just listen. They argued with one another. Here in Sanders Theater, the students argue back with me, with the philosophers they're reading. And so when it became clear that people around the world were interested in reasoning together, arguing together about big moral and civic questions, I wanted to try to push the experiment further so that instead of just putting out stuff, lectures, debates for people to watch, we could enable people to argue back across nations and cultures and distances. And that is a technological challenge, a pedagogical challenge, technological challenge, and also, I think, one of the biggest civic challenges of our day. And so I've done, with the help of some very creative IT people, a number of experiments in seeing whether it's possible, to what extent it's possible, to replicate the arguing and the reasoning and the debating that goes on in this intimate place to a global online setting. With the help of a startup in San Francisco, some years ago, we did an experiment right here with the class where we were able to link, using an iPad technology, iPad-based software, to link, and we could see, to classrooms in India, Japan, China, and Brazil. So we had 5 classrooms in 5 countries linked in real time, who could see and hear one another. It worked pretty well, but it was cumbersome to arrange, and it was not the kind of thing we could do every day. Another experiment I did, series of programs with NHK, Japan's national television system, where we linked groups of students from China, the US, and Japan for a series of discussions on big ethical and political questions. They could see and hear one another on the screens. I would stand in a studio surrounded by these screens. But now I've been engaged in a third such experiment, and I want to get your thoughts about it. Working with the BBC, a series called The Global Philosopher, we've partnered with, they've actually rented the studio at WGBH that HBX, the Harvard Business School online project, has created, where we have a wall of monitors, 60 monitors. Some of you may have seen this studio. And they use it for a kind of classroom, distant classroom setting and teaching. We used it to create BBC programs taking up hard questions, ethical questions, controversies, lying behind the headlines, where we can bring people together using this studio from, we've had roughly each time about 40 countries around the world represented on this wall of 60 monitors, including from Europe, Africa, Latin America, Asia, North America, for debate about these questions. I'd like to show you what it looks like and how it sounds. It's from a program we did recently on free speech. And the clip I'm going to show you is a debate about free speech and hate speech, whether there should be laws restricting hate speech. We had participants from places such as Russia and Iran and China, as well as a great many European and Latin American and some African countries, debating this question. Now, we've gotten pretty far, though I think there is room for improvement. So after I show you this clip from The Global Philosopher, I would like to invite you to respond, to give me your impression, partly because I'd like to get some free professional advice on how we can improve this. But so I want to hear your thoughts as IT professionals, but also as citizens and as viewers, what you make of this, how the experiment could be improved. So let's have a look at that clip, if we could, and maybe if we could dim the stage lights. In the Netherlands,
Emma.
Coming from a country that is supposed to be very tolerant in freedom of speech, I think it's important that people are allowed to express their opinions so we can maintain a dialogue. And I can become very hypocrite in a country that there's a lot of things going on without anybody knowing about it, and it's better to open it up to have and maintain a dialogue.
All right, let's bring back Frankie in Vancouver, Canada. What do you say to Emma?
Emma said to express opinions and create dialogue, but that's not what hate speech does. When we're talking about things such as degrading people with certain sexualities, degrading people of certain races, degrading people of certain heights, as someone said earlier, that is not helping political discourse. That is not grasping at an opinion. That is blatant disrespect, and it harms people.
Emma?
I can understand what you're saying, but I think I'm afraid that the people that think that way and aren't allowed to express it, that they will express it in other things than words.
You're afraid of driving the hatred underground by banning its public expression. Is that it, Emma?
Yeah, I can see you can compare it to, for example, not legalizing drugs or not legalizing being from another sexuality, that people will always maintain those kinds of feelings or thoughts, and they will express them otherwise.
In Croatia, Martina.
Yes, I think that freedom of speech is completely opposite to hate speech, because hate speech often leads to violence toward exactly those people you are speaking against. So it's not only the problem of speaking against them. Hate speech really brings to violent acts.
Okay, now Martina has introduced another consideration here, that hate speech may lead to violent acts. Emma has been opposing the hate speech laws. Is there someone else who opposes hate speech laws who would like to reply to Martina's argument that if you allow hate speech, it may lead to violence against vulnerable groups? In Seoul, South Korea, Juan.
That speeches can incite violence, and I perfectly understand that why people want to ban hate speeches, but I'm against outlawing hate speech. So I want to propose different kind of limitations where the victims, if they feel threatened, they can ask the government to protect them and not preemptively banning such speeches from being made in the first place.
So people can get protection, let people engage in hate speech, but protect the potential victims.
Yes, that's what I want to propose, different kind of limitations.
What about that? In Mogadishu, Mariam.
Hi. I actually want to argue that hate speech is a kind of violence. As someone who's had to endure hate speech, it's something that undermines your humanity. It's attacking you based on things that you can't change, and things that are maybe irrelevant to a discourse. For instance, I mean, as a student, I know that there's a lot of discussions around safe spaces and what should be allowed to be said in a classroom, because when you have a diverse group of students and some are being oppressed because of what some others are trying to say, you create this hostile environment where it's not an equal learning the opportunity to learn is not equal across the board.
All right, Marion, you said something interesting when you said that hate speech undermines the humanity of the person being targeted. And this brings out two different kinds of arguments, two different objections to hate speech that have been running through this discussion. Some of the arguments for banning hate speech worry that hate speech will lead to violent acts. But Marion raised a different kind of argument, which is the speech itself undermines humanity or expresses disrespect and inflicts, I suppose you could say, a kind of harm in and of itself, intrinsically, whether or not you could show evidence that hate speech actually leads to violent acts against those being targeted. What about that, Kyung-hee?
Well, I believe that Copernicus gave offense to religion and science by challenging the position of the sun in the earth. Martin Luther King gave offense to U.S. society and norms by challenging racism. And women are giving offense to a male-dominating society by challenging inequality. And when you say protection, you assume that the people are weak and cannot defend themselves. But shielding women from misogyny or shielding ethnic minorities from racism, isn't that paternalistic rather than being progressive?
All right, let's bring Frankie in Vancouver back to the screen to reply to Kyung-hae.
I'm absolutely shocked because I feel that academic discussion gets in the way of reality and truth. And if Marian is on a subway in Somalia and someone shouts at her for the head garment that she is wearing, that is not helpful, Kyung from South Korea. That is not leading to her to feel empowered. That is not discourse. That is hate speech, and that is disgusting. Do not say what Martin Luther King said when he was protesting for his rights was hate speech, because what we are discussing is if a person should be able to degrade someone on their ethnicity, on their sexuality, on the way that they look. And I believe that what Marian chooses to wear because of the color of her skin should never be a reason to put hate speech against her.
Kyung-hae.
But I believe that offensive speech can only be defeated by more free speech, not limiting offensive speech. Therefore, free speech should not be limited, but rather expanded.
Marian.
I think we're confusing being offensive and like hate speech with just being disruptive. If you have a controversial idea, but you substantiate it really well, that doesn't make it hate speech, and that isn't something that we're arguing about being banned. But when someone's being attacked on the basis of something they can't change and it's not contributing to a dialogue or actually furthering anything, then that in itself is damaging and hate speech.
Okay, I showed you, deliberately showed you an extended clip because beyond showing what it looks like and the cool screen with 60 people, I wanted to see in part whether you think that the main goal is achieved. The main goal is to actually develop a line of argument, a line of debate where people are not just giving their opinions randomly, but listening and responding or trying to respond to the arguments and whether there's a certain argument that emerges. And I should add, and here I would like now to open the floor to comments, responses, suggestions, criticisms, how we could do it better, how the technology might enable us to do it better, or I would just add one other feature of this is, in addition to the 60 participants who are on the video monitor, and they can see one another and hear one another as well as seeing me and hearing me. There are people who join in online who can watch it and who can text in or email, I'm not sure how it works, comments that periodically are gathered and culled and fed into the discussion by a BBC producer who occupies one of those video screens. So in principle, an unlimited number of people could be watching even though they couldn't all be on the screen. So I'd like briefly to open the floor to see whether people have reactions, suggestions, questions. Yes. And first, if you could identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Peter Brown, IT manager in the economics department.
Yeah.
It just struck me that really and I don't think you mentioned it, it seemed like one of the most powerful elements of what we just witnessed was the fact that there was a very powerful moderator at work, which was you, essentially. So in terms of democratic debate, if you use Facebook or any other sort of online method for debating things, the reason that so much debate deteriorates so rapidly is exactly because there is no moderator.
Thank you for that. I mean, it is true, whether it's me or some other moderator, it has to be, I think, public discourse. We're trying to find ways of using technology to create platforms for global public discourse. That's the big aim that interests me. And I think there is no way of doing it. I agree with Peter. There's no way of doing it just running on its own. It does require, however good the technology, it requires some structure, or it might have to be a person. I don't think it can be an algorithmically driven one, but maybe you'll tell me otherwise, to guide the discussion and give it shape and juxtapose views and so on. Thank you for that. Other thoughts? Yes. Here, we'll get you a microphone. And if you could identify yourself, please.
My name is Maureen. I work in central administration.
Yes.
And as cool as that venue was,
yeah,
with all of those monitors, it looked like it might be pretty stressful to be the person up front trying to keep track of what the technology is doing and what the people on all of the 60 screens were doing. And I wonder whether video helps or hurts the progression of the conversation and the content of the debate and the conversation.
Right, that's a great, what's your name again?
Maureen.
Maureen, it's a great question. Whether video helps or hurts, you're suggesting maybe an audio version of this might be better. And, well, I'd be interested to hear whether other people have views about that. Does someone, about Maureen's question, which I think is a really interesting one. Yes? Sitting in the second row, sorry. Yes.
Hi, my name's Jean. I'm in the Administrative Technology group.
Yeah.
So I have a comment about what Maureen said, in that one of the daily struggles in IT, where we're working with a lot of people who are remote, whether in other buildings or right. vendors or so forth, is that audio technology for having conference calls and sort of things definitely has its downside, because right. you don't get any visual cues about who is about to speak or who wants to speak, right. who is speaking, who's going to get talked over because they don't know someone else is going to engage at the same moment.
Right.
And that's a frustration and can make things very inefficient in the actual communication.
Right.
So from my perspective, having the visual cues is more helpful.
Good, thank you. And then just behind there was someone who had, in the third row.
Yeah, my name is Pamela Needham. I'm in client services at the medical school. And I have a question about the visuals. What we were just presented, I assumed was created video, but I may be wrong. Is what we saw exactly what all participants see when they are engaged in this, or did we see something slightly different?
What we saw was pretty much what the participants see themselves, because there is live mixing of the camera shots, which means that sometimes we can have two people juxtaposed on the screen, other times all four, other times one. So there is a live director mixing it so that the participants do see more or less what we saw. Then later, afterwards, the BBC does some post-production to fix things that weren't quite right, but it's basically what the participants see. And I don't want to lose track of the question about whether the video element helps or hurts the discussion. Is there someone, I have a thought about it, though I don't have a definitive answer. Is there someone else who would like to address that? Yes. Stand up, and we'll get you a microphone. First, if you could identify yourself. And then.
I'm Chris Barnhart. I work at the Extension School in digital teaching and learning. So one of the things that we do is offer these online classes. And we've put a great deal of effort into being able to provide this kind of interface that provides the video so that the instructor can see the students can see each other. And it's precisely because we believe that these visual cues to discussion and to seeing each other's reactions to what is being said is so important to making a human connection and forming these communities and these learning communities. But what I'm struck by today in the context of the previous keynote is how our visual cues from each other influence our conversations in negative ways sometimes. And I'm remembering as my career has developed in technology, when I am online and when I'm in an online class, I sometimes find it an advantage that people cannot see me and cannot see that I am a woman, and that I have a fairly gender-neutral name, and people assume that I am a man. And I'm struck by the pains I sometimes go to when I'm on an online discussion board to actively disguise my gender.
Right, that's interesting. Well, I see the force of that. I see the force of that. And I should add, by the way, that we made a version of Justice available through DCE, and I've just recently done, using the DCE technology, a version of this where we had, I think, on a screen a dozen people or 16 people at a time, a subset of the course, having this kind of discussion. So I think there are a number of versions of this technology that increasingly are available. There's a case for anonymity, blocking out prejudices. But there is also a case, I think, in teaching and learning and also in civic discourse, which is really what this project is aiming at. To seeing the person and knowing the person's name, in part because civic discourse at its best involves addressing people and their views and their opinions and their backgrounds, figuring out where they're coming from, cultivating the art of listening. But sometimes listening can be helped. It can be hurt and distorted by prejudice, but it can also be deepened and enriched by a kind of presence, a kind of human presence that's missing if there's anonymity. And I think one of the reasons that online discussion platforms so often descend into invective and obscenity and rude remarks, to go back to the earlier point, partly it's the lack of structured, directed moderation. And partly it's because anonymity can breed a kind of irresponsible stance where you don't really attend. There is a paradox in this. So I do think the image, the visual image, replicates to a degree the human presence that is important, I think, to civic dialogue. Back in ancient Greece in the ecclesia, the citizens were present to one another. Now, not all of them were present in the ecclesia. Women weren't, slaves weren't. But presence matters to teaching and learning and to civic dialogue, I think. But here's a paradox that I've noticed. In trying various of these technologies for this purpose, the visual element contributes presence, but even more important is the quality of the audio. And in particular, one feature that we sometimes take for granted, you know, there are, and you could tell me why or how it works, but there are certain forms of audio connections, and this I think is true on Skype, where if one person talks, the other person is cut off, that you can't interrupt and hear the interruption. One of the first things I learned doing the experiment back here in Sanders Theater with that iPad-based technology is that for this purpose, the ability to interrupt, though we think of interruption as rude, the ability to interrupt or to interject laughter or gasping or moaning That is an important dimension of presence, the sound of it. And so the technologies, as this technology permits, that allow interruption, actually make discussions go better rather than worse. Now, the interruption has to be contained and kept within bounds and so on. Laughter. Here's a technical thing that we wrestled with here. The engineers, because they're also producing a radio program out of this, they want to keep all of the dampers, the sound dampers, down until they get the person who's speaking. And I'm always negotiating, well, can't we keep them up a little bit? Because if this is to replicate presence, it's important to hear someone laugh or moan or groan or interrupt, or it makes a difference. So seeing is part of presence, the visual image, but the ability to interject or to interrupt and to hear that, and for the participants to hear that, is paradoxically maybe also an important part of it. I would like to shift the discussion to a different topic. Here you saw a debate about free speech and hate speech, using this distance, pretty sophisticated, but nonetheless distance technology that tries to replicate presence across cultural and national distances. And what it suggests is the technology at stake here. We're used to talking about IT, information technology. That's what the I stands for, right? And the I. But when we're thinking about teaching and learning and also about platforms for public discourse, it's not so much, maybe here's another way of putting it, the next frontier is not so much information technology, because it's not just about promulgating or publishing or broadcasting information, important though that is. It's also about enabling deliberation. So DT, maybe in 10 years from now, we'll have a DT summit, deliberative technology. That's what I would like to invite you to invent. A kind of deliberative technology that would enable the kind of public discourse and also the teaching and learning within one another's presence that we've been discussing just now. Now, I would like to put to you, maybe you'll consider it a far-out example of how deliberation and judgment are being replicated, or some would attempt to replicate these human faculties technologically in the age of apps and big data. Take this as a hypothetical. I just want to sort of take a survey of opinion, what you would think. There are dating apps. There are algorithmically driven apps that predict what movie you will like. Netflix has those. Or what book you would like, or what product will be just what you are looking for or would look for if it had occurred to you. Now suppose that these algorithms became so good, so accurate, that they could aggregate data about you, your personality, your character, your preferences, your desires, your life plans, and identify algorithmically from all the people in the world, let's say the 3 best life partners for you. Call it the marriage prediction app. Now, here's the question I'd just like to get your, off the top of your head, intuition. If there were such an app, and if it were very sophisticated, which would you trust more in deciding whom your life partner will be? The advice of the app or the advice of your parents? Let's just take a vote. How many would go for the app? Wow. And how many would go for their parents? Well, for an IT group, that's pretty impressive. Some of you are still holding out for your parents. All right, I want to show you. I put this question, I did a series of programs recently for Dutch public television where we were debating ethical questions, kind of like the Global Philosopher one, only unlike the BBC one, it was not with a high-tech studio. It was decidedly low-tech. We gathered 20, 22 young people in their 20s and 30s in an ancient Greek amphitheater to give it a Socratic flavor. And we discussed questions such as inequality, discrimination, privacy, and in one episode, AI and how smart machines could be. So, well, let's take a quick look at how they discussed it and then see what you think. How many would say the marriage prediction app? How many would go with that?
It's because you said parents. If you said somebody else.
All right, that's the alternative.
Best friend would have been another story.
All right, and how many would go with their parents' advice? Well, a handful of people would still go with their parents. Asha, you say you go with the app.
Yes,
why is
because
that?
He knows every character perspective of yourself.
Yeah.
He knows you well as you are.
Yes.
So I think he can search for a better match than my parents who will see me at home or when I'm visiting them. Even though they raised me up, there was a time that I left home and created my own life. There's a life at home and a life outside of home.
Yeah.
So I don't think they are totally capable of searching somebody who fits me in both situations.
But the app doesn't have that gut feeling. And I want to connect with a woman on a spiritual level. And the app can't feel that. So we
Your
can...
parents do?
Trust me, my mama. My mama. Trust me. My mama knows these type of things. She knows me from the inside out. So if I come home with a girl, she would notice in like 2 seconds, no, this is not good for you.
But I think the question is, and being a mama boy as well, I think the question is there any space for a mistake? Even in choosing a partner to marry, is there any space for imperfection? Because this thing works very well. It's not the algorithms that we have now. It finds the exact perfect match. But don't we want to leave something out of that perfection for something as big as marriage?
Well, I don't know if you've ever been in a relationship, but if you have a perfect match, then the mistakes start happening, right? So I mean, so there's plenty of room for mistakes if you have a good connection.
And that's what I'm saying. Like I am married, and I don't know if a perfect robot would have found exactly my wife. She would have landed top 3.
But I think if it helps you find, this is going to sound very clinical, but a list of potential partners that have a good match, it helps because it takes away a lot of the clutter of finding somebody who you have a good connection with.
Is that actual clutter, or that's part of what we call love dating?
But the very action of having an app do that for you. The perfect girl, the perfect boy, or whoever would be rendered imperfect based on the fact that there wasn't that human element of, oh, I'm in a bar and my hands are clammy, and the kind of the fluttering human experience of actually falling in love. Yeah. If you have an app provide you a perfect match, it's imperfect because you don't have the dance of falling in love.
There are apps out there that already work and where many people, you know, don't have this hesitation of dating and having clammy hands, just like picking somebody up from the bar. Same thing, just that the date was set up by Parship or whatnot. And there are people who are getting married already through that, you know.
What about the sexual part? How will the machine know
if that's a click. I mean,
how will your parents know? And that too can grow. That too will
no, but what I mean is there's got to be a personal connection, I guess, or some kind of thing, because the machine will never know. I mean,
well, we're presupposing that it does. So what they write about online dating now is that it actually doesn't matter as much if you like the same film. You need a physical connection, but we're presupposing, I think, that the app also connects you to people. But I think Sergio's question underlies, if you take away all the foraging and the searching, you take away a lot of human experience, because you miss all the clammy mistakes and wrong dates and the wrong things. So I might have actually switched back to...
But there's something Sergio said, I don't know whether this app would have my partner in that top 3. So it makes me doubting right now when I would go for that machine.
You're changing your mind.
I don't know. I'm really, because of his argument, because I'm thinking, I'm married. Would that machine pick this guy that I'm married to? I don't know.
Okay. So, did anybody change his or her mind based on... Seriously. One of the... part of what's moving, there are amusing elements, but also moving when people are listening closely enough and thinking together with their interlocutors that they sometimes find themselves, we find ourselves, changing our minds, as was, we caught a glimpse of that here. Is there, well, one question to ask, looking at these 2 episodes of debate about a moral or civic question, is whether the technology, the high-tech version in the first example, could, if perfected and improved in various ways, replicate the immediacy, the human presence of the moment of reasoning that we saw in the second case. What's your hunch? It's not anytime soon. And here, let's bring my microphone down here. Because what I want to, and what's your name?
Tracy.
And identify from where.
Tracy. I work in the library technology group here in Munich.
Not anytime soon. And why is that, do you think, Tracy?
For a lot of the factors you already outlined. I think that the power of personal connection requires personal contact, and it's just hard for me to imagine technology being able to replicate that.
Yes.
My name is Amir Kargar. I work in HMS and research computing.
Yeah.
I think that if the real goal here is to get people connected enough they can change each other's minds.
Yes.
People have changed each other's minds through text messages, through emails, through letters for centuries. And so I think that
you've had a sufficiently persuasive text message that it's changed your mind? Wait, keep the microphone there. That was not a rhetorical... I've
had some very long text messages go back and forth, so I think I have, yeah. But again, it's about creating that connection. So having the moderated conversation helps, but it all depends on getting the right group of people together and getting them the right sort of interaction that they can, speak to each other respectfully and be willing to change minds and learn together, as you said.
Good, all right. Well, thank you for that. Time for one more. Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. My name is Ramon de la Cruz from Harvard School of Public Health.
Yes.
I would like to say that the two topics were a little bit different, in my opinion. You know, the dating app versus the parents is something, you know, I'm already married. I'll give my opinion.
Right.
After that conversation, I go on with my life. I will probably never talk about it. But, you know, the racial conversation is something that I hold dear.
Right.
Emotions come into place. I'm short, so somebody making fun of my shortness is something deep into me. So I think on the second conversation, people stay on track on what they were talking about.
Yes.
On the first one, people went, you know, whether I should you ban it? Should it's okay to say it?
Right.
Is it gonna cause violence?
Right, the hate speech.
Yes,
Yeah.
so I will say the topics were a little bit different.
Right, so they're not strictly comparable.
Yes, and it's the second topic, maybe not too much in the emotional level, was more logical.
I see.
Yeah,
well,
and,
it's interesting.
Changing minds is a little bit easier on the second topic, I would say.
It's interesting that you say that the free speech, hate speech debate was more passionate and emotional, whereas whether a machine could tell you whom to marry, that's just academic, an academic topic. I think there might be a division of opinion on that question, but I think you raise an important point that it's hard strictly to compare these as examples of debate, reasoned argument, dialogue, deliberation, not only because the mediation of technology distinguishes them, but also because the subject matter does, and of course the participants as well. When I first began this series of experiments in using technology to open access to the Harvard classroom, the main goal back then was to show that higher education could be a public good, not just a private privilege. That's what animated, for me, the first experiment, putting the justice course online. But because of its subject matter, which goes right to the heart of our civic life, and because of the growing importance of learning from one another and reasoning together across cultures and national boundaries, the second aspect of the project, using technology to create global platforms for public discourse, seemed to me, well, the next frontier. We've learned a lot about teaching and learning through the use of technology, and also about the dangers and the possibilities that the internet and social media pose for public discourse. For the most part, the record to date in the world at large is not very good. Not very good. For the most part, social media and the internet have contributed to the general debasement, I would say, of public discourse. And yet, it's a tremendous potential resource if we can figure out how to use it. And so that's a project where we together, those of us interested in promoting public discourse, those of us involved in teaching in the classrooms, need to work together and learn from those of you who have already carried us a long way toward exploring these possibilities. The challenge as we continue this work together, and the challenge, the invitation I would put to you, is to see whether we can, in the coming years, working creatively together, make of social media and the internet platforms of genuine listening and learning and arguing and reasoning together rather than shouting at one another. In short, to convert IT to DT, information technology, to deliberative technology. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for spending time with us. It's not hard to see why he's called a philosopher with the profile of a global rock star. And we have him right here at Harvard, which is incredible. But thank you for making such a relevant talk for us and for asking us what we think. I think everyone here will sign up to be part of your army to create deliberative technology. So thank you. Just a few housekeeping notes before we break. All of our concurrent sessions are at Emerson and Seaver Hall in Harvard Yard. There are posters in both buildings and volunteers with teal ribbons on their badges if you have any questions. We're going to be back here at 12 o'clock across the transept for lunch. Check out your programs for the lunch options. Please also be back here at 3:30 for our afternoon keynote speaker, Danoff, Dean of Harvard College, Rakesh Khurana. You will not want to miss it. Finally, we will see you all at our afternoon reception in Annenberg at 4:30. Have a great day.